Welcome to the Get Invested podcast with Bushy Martin. I'm Andrew Montesi, the producer of the show, kicking off our third and final series of interviews with Bushy, where he has been unpacking the story, insights and strategy behind his own property, wealth and lifestyle journey. This time, a recent Get Invested guest, Rob Flux from Property Developer Network, turns the tables on Bushy for his In the Beginning series, where Bushy goes all the way back to the start of his property investment story, revealing his own personal roadmap to make his lifestyle dreams a reality. There's plenty here that you'll be able to learn and apply to your own process. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Get Invested podcast, where we share great conversations with experts from all walks of life to uncover their secret know-how and where they invest their time, their skills and their money, and the benefits that this has created. You see, the truth is that everyone invests. Every minute of every day, we're investing our time, our skills, our energy and our money in something. Some of us are investing consciously, some unconsciously, sometimes for good, sometimes for bad, and sometimes for no impact. Get Invested will help you to start living by design, not by default. I'm going to help you to make it happen, not let it happen. You will hear the top tips on how you can live with conscious intent so that you can live more, work less, and leave a living legacy by investing now. Listen to the show to discover the top tips on how to get started, make the most of your investment journey, and ultimately to be living your dream, not someone else's. More episodes can be found on iTunes or at bushymartin.com.au/get invested. Thanks for listening, and now let's get invested.
Hey folks, it's Rob Flux here with another Sunday session. Now, today we have a very special guest. We've got Bushy Martin. Now, Bushy is an award-winning author. He's also the co-founder of Know How Property, and he's also runs one of the most popular property investment podcasts out there called Get Invested. And as of lately, has just taken over Australia's largest running podcast called The Reality Talk, which has been running for many, many years from Kevin Turner. He's just taken over that. Now, Bushy and his wife, Sonia, are Australia's leading pioneers in the emergent area of living by design through smart property strategy. And with that, Bushy has actually been ranked in the top 10 Australian specialists through Property Investor magazine. So with all of that said, what I would like to do is welcome Bushy to the stage. So, mate, welcome aboard.
Great to see you, Rob. Very honoured and humbled to join you. I really enjoyed our long chat on the Get Invested podcast recently, which we got some really good feedback from the audience on, by the way, mate. And
no worries. I'm pleased to return serve, and I did have a tiny little graphic issue in the background, but who cares about that? We're on with the show. Now, mate, we just touched on the fact that you're running a couple of different podcasts. So the Get Invested property, you've been running that for 7 odd years, I think, 230 odd episodes so far. As you touched on, I was lucky and fortunate to be, I guess, a guest on that very recently. So thank you for that opportunity. Mate, what got you into that?
Into the podcast? Yeah, well, interesting, mate. I guess I'd been in the property game consulting pretty much as a strategist together with our finance broking team for quite some time. And found myself pretty much having the same conversation day in, day out on a one-on-one basis. And it was like, okay, well, how can we get this message out there to a much wider audience? And I'd sort of luckily be at the stage where, I often say now that I've shifted from success to significance in terms of what our focus is these days. And what that meant was I'm wanting to give back, Rob. So the first entourage onto that was to write the book, and believe you me, writing a book, if I knew now what I knew then before I wrote the book, I wonder whether I would have done it, because a lot of blood, sweat and tears. We got that going. And then I'd wanted to move from a one-to-one to a one-to-many type of format. And the podcasting world was just starting to open up. I actually, many years ago, spent some time in the executive recruiting game. And I actually interviewed, I think, 2,000 or 3,000 people over a couple of year period, and got very good at asking questions and then shutting up and listening, which you wouldn't believe it, given the amount that I talk. But I thought, well, yeah, that's a good fit for a podcast. So this is a great way to get some great people on and share some learnings. And it's taken off from there, and it's been a lot of fun, mate. I love every second of it.
Well, as I said, 200 I think I was episode 230. So yeah, past that now. So you're probably 235-ish and growing. I guess take me all the way back to episode number 1. Can you remember who guest number 1 was?
I can.
And how did you convince them to come on board when you were coming from absolute zero, ground zero start?
Well, I took the cheats entry, mate. I actually reached out to our podcast producer. I can remember Ronsley Vaz at the time. We now produce it a different way, but Ronsley was a bit of a guru in the startup entrepreneurial field. He actually started the first national podcasting conference around the country, and when I decided to do it, and we were getting him to produce it, I said, look, do you mind if I grind my teeth on you? And he came on board. He's done a bit of investment himself over the years, so it was a pretty good fit. And it was interesting at the end of the conversation, when we turned off the record button, he said, Bushy, you're actually really good at this. I think because I asked some questions that he wasn't expecting, and I drew some insights from stuff that he was doing that he'd never actually recognized in himself. And he said, yeah, I think you're going to do really well on this. And mate, I've been like a kid in a lolly shop ever since, Rob. It's just been rubbing shoulders from great people, learning a lot of new stuff as we go through. It's really been, as I've said to you off air, the best personal development exercise I could possibly come into. And it's just added to the armory in terms of the breadth and the depth of information that I now have at my disposal, mate. So it's been awesome.
Absolutely, mate. I feel the same in going through my journey. I'm fortunate to rub shoulders with many, many people, some of them like yourself. I don't do as many interviews, and that's something that I'm starting to get a little bit more into. But, mate, it's a fun process. Now, I'm not going to hold your feet to the fire and ask you who's your favourite, guest, because that would be unfair. However, can you give us some really fantastic lessons that you've picked up from that, and who was the person that actually gave you that lesson, if you can recall?
Wow. Okay. It's such a broad depth, mate, because one of my, and we'll probably get into this, but my definition of sustainable success is the intersection of self-health and wealth. And I'll talk more about that shortly. So I don't just focus purely on the property piece. I throw the net a little bit wider because I think, that sustainable success is the intersection of those three. If I look at some of the memorable guests and the ones that I got a lot out of and enjoyed the most, were the likes of Paul Roos, who was the Sydney Swans coach for quite some time. I've been a big fan of Paul's for many years anyway, but to actually spend some time with him understanding the trials and tribulations that he's been through and the very different way that he approaches things. And it's funny how what I got from Paul was that a lot of football teams are very micromanaged and very transactional. He took a very visionary approach to saying, okay, well, we're not worried about what we're doing today. Let's worry about what we're doing in 5 or 6 seasons' time and work towards that. So, and he took the whole management team, all the players, all the support team on exactly the same journey. Had a very clear vision of where he was going and got everyone to buy into that vision. And it's a lot of parallels with what he did in that arena, because I've always said that sport is almost a microism of life anyway. But the property investment journey is no different. You need to have a very clear indication of what the end destination looks like, and get very vivid in the detail with that, both from a lifestyle, a financing, and a property perspective, because there's 3 elements to that. And then if that's magnetic enough, you'll override the inevitable speed bumps that you're going to incur along the journey, but you also then have a compass upon which to measure the decisions you're making day to day. So is what I'm doing taking me closer to that destination or further away? So that was one of the big learnings I got from Paul. In terms of the property aficionados that have come under the show, and that there's been a lot. I'm trying to think of some of those that would be really relevant. I've had some really good buyers agents on the show. that have shared a lot of information. Kevin Turner, who hosts, was the host of Realty Talk, and he's now been, some would say brave enough, and others would say dumb enough to let me loose on the microphone. He because it's similar to you and I, Rob. He's spoken to so many people over the years that he just brings a wealth of wisdom to the table when it comes to property, and a lot of insights that have come out of that. So that's probably just a little bit of a sample of some of those. But there's been some awesome guests from a whole range of areas, from property through to the equities markets. I've also had some great guests on there. John Lee Dumas, who is a massive, he's an incredible audience over in the States and across the globe with the podcast that he hosts. He came on the show and shared his investment journey, which is more on the equity side of the equation. Well, mind you, he lives in Puerto Rico because there's zero tax in Puerto Rico, and he's got property.
Let me write that down somewhere.
Yes. A good tax haven, and the Puerto Rican government actually entices people to come and live there for that very reason. So they make it very attractive for people to do it. But he's more an equities investor because, as we probably all know, the States is much more an equities market than it is a property market. And very different dynamics in property in the States, and I own property in the States, so I know that firsthand. But I've had the privilege of talking to some great people, including yourself, mate. So it's been a great journey.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess what I want to do now, Bushy, I guess people, may know you from those two areas. This might be the first time that they're actually meeting you, but give people just some insights into, I guess, how you're actually living your life by design. That's one of your core principles, how you're living your life by design. And then what we're going to do is we're going to unpack that and take everyone all the way back to how did you actually get there in the first place? So where are you at right now?
Yeah, well, we're loving life, Rob. As I sort of mentioned briefly before, I've sort of shifted from the success to the significance stage of my life, and it's more about giving back in all forms. So one of the key things I learned from my good mother, Rob, was that true fulfillment comes from giving freely to others without ever expecting anything in return, or in fact them knowing that you're even doing it. So my mother was one of those country girls who was always about helping everyone and everyone else, and she sort of passed that on to me. So we now live a very privileged lifestyle, mate. So I spend my weeks podcasting, both on Realty Talk and the Get Invested podcast. I still do a fair bit of writing because I love writing and getting the information out there and sharing it. We love to travel. So we're on our road trip as we speak. So we're spending a month on, month off in different locations around Australia at the moment. We've travelled a lot overseas, but given the COVID exercise, we've never really taken the time to have a really good look around our own country. So I'm speaking to you today from south of Adelaide, down on the Fleurieu Peninsula.
And from one of your investment properties, yeah?
Yes, exactly right. So we're doing a little bit of work or we're organising a little bit of work on the investment property as we speak. But we're doing a road trip that's going to take us along the coast of Victoria and up into New South Wales and the northwestern region of Tasmania over the next 6 to 12 months. We don't really have a timeline on it. We can pretty much do that from anywhere now. We've really set up life in terms of the business exercise where our team operates from all over the country. It's all virtual now because thanks to COVID, people are quite happy to meet via Zoom and we don't need to be sitting in their living rooms at nights and on weekends anymore. So that's freed us up a fair bit. The other thing that we love doing, we actually rescue Samoyed dogs, Rob. So we've currently got 2. We had 4 up until recently, and that we take on old dogs that people don't want anymore. They're just a beautiful dog, the Samoyeds. The white smiling faces, great to wake up to. I'm a closet muso, so I spend a lot of time on the piano, and don't let me near a microphone, Rob, because I don't even need to have a drink to jump on the karaoke. And used to play in bands for years, and I'm still a mad keen field hockey player. So I'm actually playing my 800th game in about 2 or 3 weeks' time. I've been playing since I was 11.
That's a lot of effort. 800
yeah, Well, I've got the scars to prove it, Rob. You share with me the scar that you got under your eye from playing in Darwin years ago. I think I'm
Yeah,
pretty
so
much.
for everyone's benefit out there, I dabbled in playing, outdoor hockey for a little while, and have 7 stitches underneath my eye from a hockey ball straight to the head. It did save a goal, so it was it guess was not in vain, but it was to the bone, and it was not a very pretty sight. So the AstroTurf got a little bit of a spray that day, but mate. Anything where you're getting out and actually exerting yourself, pushing your limits, and particularly in a team sport. I guess most of mine was in rugby, but I guess there's the physical endurance for yourself. There's the team work. There's the camaraderie. There's the social aspects, and then there's the embellishment of the stories that get better and better into the night.
Exactly right. And that's what keeps me going, man. I'm one of those people who needs a goal to be working towards. If you don't give me a goal, I don't do anything. So I'm either a sort of 100% person or a nothing person. And the reason I keep playing hockey is for all the reasons you've just mentioned, but it means that I need to keep fit. So as you know, hockey's a very active game. There's a lot of start, stop, and you need to be pretty fit to get out there. So that really keeps me on my toes as far as that goes. But if we sort of draw that back to the living by design, what we're doing now is very much what Sonia and I decided we wanted to do about 25 years ago when we first got together. And we, spending an architect for 17 odd years, so it sort of becomes part of your way of looking at life, where you're always designing how you want something to be and get really clear on what that looks like. And then it's a matter of just taking the steps between where you are and where that is to make that happen. So we spend a lot of time, and every year when we go on holidays, we spend between 2 to 4 days revisiting our life plan. Has anything changed in our goals? Has anything changed in terms of our what does our lifestyle cost? Has anything changed in relation to our portfolio in terms of its values? Do we need to restructure the finances? A constant monitoring exercise now just to manage that. But it's been all about focusing on exactly how we want to live. And it took us over 15 years to make that happen. But we're very privileged now to be able to give back and to spend time sharing a lot of the lessons we've learned along the way on podcasts and shows like yours, and through the other work we do in that regard.
That's great, mate. Well, let's start that process of taking you all the way back. Now, you touched on the fact that you are an architect. Some would say that gives you an unfair advantage in the process. So firstly, when did you do your architect's degree? How long ago was that? And how long did you actually work as an architect?
Yeah, so I finished high school. I'm a country boy, and hence the Bushy, mate. Bushy from the bush. My old man was Bushy Senior. I finished high school in the huge rural metropolis of Bordertown in the southeast of South Australia many years ago. And that was in about 1977, I think, mate. So you do the maths, you can probably work out how old. Oh, no, there's too many numbers there. There's too many numbers. But the reason I'm probably important for me to say why I got into architecture, actually, because it has a bit of a property base to it. Because I was born with a hair lip, and it looks like a hockey scar, but it's actually a hair lip. And I was also had really bad chronic asthma when I was a kid, so I spent a lot of time in bed. And I used to get called a flat-faced, punk-chested runt because we moved around the countryside. My old man was a stock and station agent, so we used to move from country town to country town across Victoria and South Australia. So I was always the new boy in town, so I used to get picked on a fair bit. And because I spent so much time in bed, I used to draw. I used to love drawing and designing, and I just had a real creative bent. And I always remember my good father saying to me, "Yeah, well, that's all very good, son, but someday you're going to have to get a real job." And so the old young brain was ticking over, going, "Well, how can I combine my love of drawing and designing with something that's that real job?" And I know I'll become an architect. So that's about as simple as I got. And I sort of made that decision, I think, in about first year high school. So I was on a mission to get into architecture. I knew zero about architecture, and the first couple of years at uni were a real challenge to me, Rob, because I was alongside a lot of people in the course whose family had an architecture background, so they knew much more about the whole exercise than I did. But I sort of one thing I learned being the punk-chested runt was I just work harder than everyone else. So I just went hard, and I reflect back now, there were a couple of years there when I did my honours and thesis in the last 2 years where I averaged 4 hours sleep a night for those 2 years to make that happen. And out of that, and part of the reason for that was also my father used to dabble in property. So he was a stock and station agent, and we were in remote country towns, but he was also wanting to make some money because stock and station agents weren't paid big quids in those days. So he delved into the property side of the equation, and he was actually back in the days where you could actually buy blocks of land with a long enough settlement period, and then he would assign the sale before he settled and make a few grand on the way through. So we used to spend a lot of our weekends sitting in the car with Dad, driving around looking at areas, and that sort of started to get into the psyche to some degree, and sort of without me, it was a bit more peripheral and almost subliminal, but it was like, okay, well, there might be something in this property thing. So that's what started the architecture exercise. When I finished architecture, I did it in Adelaide at the Adelaide Uni. When I finished, there was no work for architects at the time. This was in the early 1980s, and I often jokingly say the only thing being built in Adelaide at the time were gravestones, Rob. So I actually worked for free for a couple of architectural practices for a few months just to get some experience. I said, you don't have to pay me, I just want to get some experience. But I ended up scoring a job in New Guinea, working for a developer up there who'd made big money in the crocodile farming, or selling crocodile skins to the jewelry makers in France and Japan. And he got into property development, and he wanted someone in-house. So I call it my Indiana Jones years, Rob, because I spent a couple of years up there, and it's real, very interesting territory in New Guinea.
I can imagine. I know many people that have spent lots of time in New Guinea, and there's areas where you need, I guess, guns and machetes and barbed wire fences, and there's other really beautiful, majestic areas. So which part were you in, mate?
A bit of both. So I spent half my time in Port Moresby, and I've often said if the world needs an enema, that's the right place to do it, because, excuse my French, it's a bit of an arsehole of a place, to be honest. And just as you described, we were living in compounds with 12-foot high razor ribbon wire around the outside, dog security, grills on the doors. I lost a girlfriend who came up to visit me, and we got broken into by a bunch of the locals, the rascal gangs, as they used to call them in those days, who broke in, and she jumped on the plane the next day and never spoke to her again. But a really good experience, mate. I'd actually designed some townhouses in Moresby for this guy, and building them was a bit of fun and games. But I also did a wilderness lodge out in a beautiful spot called Tufi on the northeast coast. So I actually lived out there with a Kiwi surveyor at the time, and we did the design and put it together, and then used locals to actually build it. Very basic and fundamental, but absolutely beautiful part of the world, mate. It was like we were right on the coast. It was in the area where the old Mosquito squadrons from the US Navy used to hide and zip out and attack the Japanese during World War II. So the beautiful deep harbours that were full of fish. It was a real tropical paradise, mate. So I had the best of both worlds. I loved the time out there, but didn't enjoy the time in Moresby so much.
Well, on the surface, mate, you got a cracking start. So you architect by trade, you're getting in-house experience from a developer and that sort of thing. So, I'm looking forward to where this is going to go, to see whether or not that actually comes out to fruition a little bit later. But after PNG, mate, what was your next move after that?
Yeah, so I went from New Guinea to Darwin. So I spent a couple of years in Darwin. And had a great time up there. There was lots of work happening and lots of building going on in Darwin at the time. A lot of the Greek developers, we did a lot of work for them, unit developments and a whole bunch of others, commercial buildings, you name it. After that, I then
we probably bumped into each other there, Bushy. I spent 33 years in Darwin. It's a hell of it's a lovely place to visit, but after 33 years, I think you're over it.
Well, Darwin and PNG are a bit similar, mate. They used to say to me that the only people who end up at Darwin, they're all running away from something. And in the New Guinea exercise, they used to say that people that go there are either missionaries, mercenaries, or madmen. And I'm still trying to work out which category I fit into, mate. But that sort of was a pretty equivalent description for Darwin. But I had an awesome time there, mate. A lot of work going on. It's a sort of place where, as an architect, you know, in Adelaide, for example, it was more about who you knew rather than what you could do. But Darwin, if you had the ability and you were prepared to work hard, you got lots of opportunity. So that's why I was attracted to the place, and I had a ball up there. It was a very social town, and you know, played indoor hockey and outdoor hockey like you did. Met some great mates up there. I then got attracted to Alice Springs to open an office for an architectural practice that was based in Adelaide. They were looking to expand, and I heard about it, and I put my hand up. Went to Alice to do that. I ended up starting my own architectural practice. I think I was in the early 20s at that stage, with another guy who was a fair bit older than me. And again, we were doing a lot of development work, and that really was the trigger for us to do our own development, which was my first entree into the serious property investment piece. And
this is all the way back when? So we're talking how long ago now?
This would have been mid 1980s.
Okay, so architect, worked for a developer in PNG, worked for developers in Darwin. I guess you got your own architecture practice in Alice Springs, and then you go, I can do this. It looks easy.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what I thought. How hard can this be? I mean, I've been doing it for years. This is dead set easy. So there was myself and two other architects that we were part of the practice. We said, and we actually partnered up with a local developer to do a 1 into 4 apartment development. And it was like, oh, this is going to be so good. We're going to do something that's so much better than everything else that's in town. And it was like the Taj Mahal of apartment developments. They were 3-bedroom apartments, corner block, overlooking a park. It was the perfect exercise. The mistakes, but let me talk about the mistakes we made. Number one, we had no clear exit strategy. Number two, we had no clear, I'll call it a prenup, but no clear shareholders agreement that focused on how we were going to get out and what happened if we didn't have any of that. We spent way too much money, overcapitalized beyond belief in terms of what the market would bear. Because, you know, I often say to people now, if you get into property, you want to be in the sweet spot of what people are prepared to pay, and start there and work backwards in terms of...
And which is a really, really important thing that I want everyone to walk away with, because it doesn't matter how perfectly you run your project or how well, I guess, you've identified an easy site, or I guess how much you get it exactly on budget. If you can't sell it, like, you never get paid.
Spot on, absolutely spot on. And the other thing I would say to that is plan for the worst and then expect the best. So if you can't sell them and you end up having to hold them and rent them, is that sustainable for you until such time as you can pass them on? So, which is what we ended up doing. We ended up renting a bunch of them. We sold them progressively over a period of time. But we went through one of the partners ended up in divorce, so he wanted a fire sale. It just became an absolute nightmare, Rob, when I look back on it. But some really good learnings that came out of that, because, you know, that's I've tended to have that tendency of either diving in deep or not doing it at all, and walked away from that with a lot of lessons that were very useful moving forward beyond that. But certainly overcapitalizing and not reading the market. And if you're doing a development, let's face it, you're not looking at what the market's doing today. You're looking at what the market's doing in 12 or 18 months' time, and that can shift pretty substantially. So you've got to be very conservative and really control the cost to make sure that the sale price with some profit in it is going to be sustainable at the time when you do want to pull the trigger on that. And that's a massive mistake we made, mate. We just thought, oh, well, these are going to be so much better. People are going to pay so much more for them. But I often use the old Holden analogy, you know, between the difference between a Statesman and a Belmont. They're still Holdens, which is what the average punter thinks. Well, that's a Holden. I'm only prepared to pay X for a Holden. We don't care whether it's a Statesman or a Belmont. We're only going to pay that amount. Well, that's exactly how you need to think about property, because look at the base common denominator. What are people paying for a 3-bedroom townhouse in that particular area at that particular time, and then work backwards to configure your cost to make sure that you can actually make profit at that level.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned lots of lessons, and you've touched on a couple of them, but what one lesson would you say is still living with you today from that particular project?
Yeah, start with the end in mind. It's pretty much influenced everything I've done since that time, mate. So you get really crystal clear on what the end game looks like, and be very conservative with that, and worst case with that, so that if the worst case happens, you're still going to be okay. That was very much the exercise, and then make sure that you actually have an agreement. Now, there's 4 of us involved in that, so that's like marrying 4 people, pretty much. That's the analogy I like to use. And you have enough trouble when you marry one person, let alone 4, because we all have changing.
If they're the wrong person.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right. And when you're marrying 4 of them, I don't know how polygamists do it, mate. It's not my cup of tea. But getting really clear and actually having a prenup or a shareholders agreement or a JV agreement or whatever you want to call it, that looks at the what if scenarios. So if this happens, this is what's going to happen, and do that at the start while you're still in love with each other and you've still got the rose-colored glasses on, because when it turns to poo, people tend to take a very different view of life, and it can get ugly and very expensive very quickly.
Absolutely. I'd add to that whilst you want to capture all of that and put it for every single exit strategy you can think of, is someone going to get sick? Is someone going to die? Is the market going to change? All sorts of things like that. Does somebody lose their job? The best contract is one that you've gone through that, is there, but sits in the top drawer and never gets looked at.
Spot on. Absolutely spot on. Yeah, have those provisions there so that if you have to fall back on it, you've already had the discussion. But if you've done it well, you'll never need to, mate. It'll end up in the waste bin at the end of the project. But if you haven't had the conversation and had the hard conversations around all of those what ifs, then you're really setting yourself up for some expensive lessons.
So how long were you physically stuck in that deal? You said it went horribly wrong. You had to hold on to them. How long were you stuck in that before you had to unravel it, or before you?
Yeah, well, about a 5-year period. That before we were totally out of it, we tried to go down the road of there was 4 of us, so why don't we have 1 each? But then people start feeling, well, yeah, but yours is worth more than mine, and there's all of that stuff that goes into it as well, mate, because we hadn't had the conversation. So we ended up doing that in the finish. Once one of the parties sold and got out, the 3 remaining, we ended up taking a property each, and then I just waited for the right time to sell it, and we basically fire sailed at the finish, mate. We lost some money on it, but we certainly learned a lot of very valuable lessons as a result of that.
I can imagine that would have made you very gun shy towards the property development process moving forward, and I guess that's going to bear out, and I guess in the rest of the chat that we're going to have here. But did you ever, I guess, have a second crack at property development, or I guess later on, did you go for that more passive approach?
Yeah, a bit of a mix, actually. Again, this is one of the probably the core messages that is worth focusing in on. It's about what is the right approach for the right time, given where you're at. So you need to align where you're at in terms of your own investment journey, and I often talk about, in the Freedom Formula, my book, I talk about the capital growth to cash flow curve. And depending on where you're at on that capital growth to cash flow curve, and what's happening in the market, and what your risk appetite is, and all of the factors that we need to feed into this, that will tend to drive the type of property solution that you need to adopt at that time. So yes, the first couple of properties of ours were initially bought on the basis of, and this, I'm talking, I often talk about my life being in 2 halves, Rob. There's the AD, which is there's a BC, which was before my early life crisis, which is when my marriage went belly up in my early 30s. And then there's AD, which is after the divorce. And once I got back into the investment arena after the divorce, with a very different mindset, that was initially more about buy and hold. But in saying that, the property that I'm sitting in now, that I'm talking to you from, we picked this property up back in 97, 98 for about 84 grand. We actually did some major renovations on this particular property, pretty much doubled its footprint. We'd held it for about 4 or 5 years when we did that. The property is now worth just shy of $1 million, given what's happened in the last couple of years. So weren't scared to get stuck into the renovation side. We have done a 1 into 2. I did a corner block 1 into 2. How long ago now? About 5 years ago-ish, and have done a lot of new build property. So again, the architecture side of things means I'm not scared of building. I have learned some lessons around the exercise about making sure that it's more about the numbers than it is about the property. And that's something that I'd probably want to reinforce, that do your numbers and do your numbers well right from the get-go. Build it on paper first and make sure the numbers work, and then the property falls out of that. Not the other way around. I see way too many investors focus purely on the property, and the numbers become a secondary exercise. That's a recipe for disaster.
Absolutely. And we'll dive into that in a little bit more detail, but you kind of threw a throwaway line in there, I guess the before crisis side of things. And mate, I want to dive into the fact that, you're off to, a good start from a career. You had a good crack at, I guess, having a development that didn't quite go to plan. And then I guess, like many of us, we hit a wall, and in your instance, I think it was a divorce that actually hit. What happened in that spot there? Because I guess what we're trying to show our audience is that, hey, these bad things happen, but I guess it's the resilience that we have. It's how we actually get out of these. So let's dive deep in there, if you're okay with that, Bushy, and then we'll see how you crawled out, mate.
Yeah, no, I'd love to, mate. And I agree with you. If you've read the book, The Obstacle is the Way, which sort of goes back to the old Stoic principles, it's your biggest challenges in life that give you the biggest learnings and the biggest opportunities. And it doesn't feel like that at the time. In fact, it feels very much the opposite at the time. But when you reflect back on it, I wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for those challenges that came along. And you're right. My biggest challenge was the downfall of my marriage. And I've got absolutely no one to blame but myself, Rob. As I think I've touched on, I was a bit of a workaholic. I learned early in life, because I was that flat-chested, short-assed, punk-chested runt. My only way of keeping up with everyone was to work harder than everyone else. And that became pretty much a sort of a go-to approach for everything that I did from that point on. And that's good to a point, but it has its downfall. So, as an architect, it can become extremely obsessive. I was a miserable person as an architect, actually, because you become very critical of the world, and you're trying to design everything and control everything is pretty much the way it sort of leads you towards going. And you're sitting in a restaurant and you'd be criticizing the cornice, or those chairs don't match it. It becomes a very obsessive, critical sort of way of looking at life. I was running a practice and running projects. So I had a fair bit on my plate. I was working, 10 to 14 hours a day, 7 days a week. I was married. I had my son during that stage. I was still in Alice Springs at that time. And no surprise, my partner had enough. And when I look back on it now, I can't blame her at all, mate. I was an absentee father, pretty much. And I took it pretty hard, I've got to say, Rob, because being a country boy and brought up in that environment, it was the old one wife and one bank for life sort of routine was pretty much the upbringing. So I took it pretty hard when the marriage went down, and I pretty much withdrew for 2 years. I call it my Howard Hughes years, where I sort of crawled into a hole, and I actually did my master's in business during that time. That was purely an excuse, to be honest, to have a really good look at myself and look at what was I going to do differently from that point on. So I had more counselling on myself at that stage to get my head set right, because as I say, I think sustainable success is a mix of self, which is what's between your ears, health, which is your happy habits and your daily disciplines that then build the determination and the discipline that you need to be able to be successful with your wealth. So that's really key. So without knowing it at the time, I immersed myself in, I read every book that you could get your hands on at that stage. And I'm in hundreds of books. I'm still an avid reader. But about the same time, my good father, who'd always been my role model, he was also a bit of a workaholic. His body started to fall to bits. So he had cancer and he had multiple strokes. He actually spent the last 10 years of his life dribbling out of the side of his mouth, paralysed in a wheelchair with mum as a carer. And I'll never forget him saying to me, son, and this is not long before he passed, he looked me on and he said, son, it's about time you stop working for money and started to get money to work for you. And that really resonated because I always respected Dad. It pretty much became a mantra. And about the same time, another mate of mine dragged me along to a Robert Kiyosaki conference in Adelaide. Robert Kiyosaki was actually in Adelaide at the time. So I went along and I had a listen. And again, he said something that still resonates with me today. He said that the moment you make passive income a part of your life will change forever. And that there was an absolute penny drop. I actually call it my Kiyosaki moment these days. And then I read everything I could get my hands on his. So Rich Dad, Poor Dad, I bought the cash flow game because I wanted to get my family involved in understanding what that was all about. And pretty much from that day onwards, everything that we've done with my good wife, now wife Sonia and I, has been based on if it's not going to grow in value, if it doesn't give you an income stream and it's not a saleable asset, we're not interested. So, and that flowed through what we invested in to what we did work-wise. So I'd gone from pretty much an employee up until the crisis. From that moment on, it became crystal clear. I did have an architectural practice in partnership with a couple of people, but you're still not doing it by your own, essentially. So from that point on, we decided that we would. I use an expression now. We became passive aggressive investors. So we were very aggressive about pursuing anything that had a passive opportunity. Yeah.
And clearly, from what you've touched on, I guess where you see the opportunity to actually force value onto the property through the renovations or new builds and that sort of thing. So you kind of you're blending the development world with the investment world opportunistically in that, by the sound of it.
Very much so. Very much so. So that, very quickly, Sonia and I decided, and I talk about now as I call it the money medicine. We decided that one of us would work and the other would build the wealth. So it's the worker and the wealth builder. And if you're familiar with that Olympic bike race where you've got two riders riding as a pair, one's going flat out around the track while the other one's sitting up on the bank waiting, and then they come down, they change over and the other goes hard. Sonia and I did the same thing. So initially she was actually running a recruitment business at the time. I got into share trading because we had zero. That at 33, I had nothing, mate. I got out of my first marriage with an old beat up Toyota and my cassettes. That was it. So we had to literally start again. So I thought, I know how I can put some money together quickly. I'll day trade. So I spent $5,500. I borrowed the money actually to do a day trading course. I traded CFDs, and that was an absolute roller coaster ride. I had some pretty heavy losses, but I managed to cobble enough money together to get our first deposit on the property. And then we also decided, once we started investing in the property side of the equation, we were looking at allied businesses that we could put our energy into and leverage off our skills. So Sonia started a property management business because we were so dissatisfied with the quality of the property managers that we had in our own properties. We thought, we can do this better. So I went and got my real estate license, and then Sonia drove the business. While she was doing that, I actually went back and did some project management consulting for the Department of Health and looked after the health portfolio here in Adelaide. Once the rent roll had got up to a particular point and it was carrying it, then I jumped in and started a finance broking business because I learned very early that property is very much a game of finance, and your access to finance and the cost of that finance can really make a massive difference to your ability to continue to acquire property and the holding cost of that. So I jumped on board into that exercise. We ended up then selling the rent roll, and we're investing in properties all the way along this track, by the way. But one of the other key messages I guess I would like to impart with your audience, Rob, is that you need an income to create an income. So, I hear a lot of people talk about the need to, to become a full-time property developer. That's okay if you can get in bed with someone else who has the income that's going to allow you to borrow the money to put into the property exercise. But for us, we recognise that we need one to be generating the income, the other one to be creating the wealth. And that brought us to the point where we could sell a rent roll, and now Sonia and I work hand in hand in the property. And it's very much a lifestyle business for us now. We don't want to be a big business. We get a lot of fulfillment from helping others on their journey and helping them to get really clear on what their strategy is based on who they are, where they are, and what they're trying to achieve. And that's the essence of the living by design and freedom formula approach that we now help people with.
Mate, we've got so many similarities in that story. It's not funny. Like it's ridiculous. The what you're calling the money medicine. We did something similar in our household. It was one person was cash flow, the other one was cash cow. Different terminologies, but the same thing. I did foreign exchange trading and I guess what is called. I'm trying to think what the name of it called, a covered call. So it's an option over a share that you then I guess on sell to other people. So did a lot of that. Equally enjoyed the same roller coaster. And I guess decided to step off a little bit, about 80K lighter for the privilege in the process. So I think all of us that have been successful have gone through many instances where we've gone, well, we need to make something work. And, when you get far enough down, you go, well, it's time to step out of that because that clearly ain't it, until you finally find the one that sticks. So well done in finding the one that finally sticks, mate. So in that process of I guess doing that for yourself, at what was the point that you decided that, hey, there's actually a business in trying to help other people to step into this realm and show them the way? So you've got a business called Know How Property. So I guess when did that start? What was the I guess the segue that got you into that business?
Yeah, that's really good. So the predecessor to Know How, I mentioned that I got on board with two partners in a finance broking business, and they were finance gurus. I knew nothing about finance, so I knew I needed to align myself with people who really knew the ins and outs of it. What I could bring to the table was the property knowledge. So that became the heart of the triumvirate. And we built a really successful business at that point in time, but and here's a big but for me, we ended up with a business that was controlling us, not us controlling the business. So we had 30 employees. We had a lot of financial pressure. There's a lot of mouths you have to feed when you've got that many under the tree. Luckily, because I learned that lesson years ago, we had a prenup with my business partners that we sit down. We had a love fest for 4 days before we even started the business, where we went right through all of those what ifs and we actually signed off on that agreement. And it got to the point where we all sat down with each other one day and said, we just don't want to do this anymore. This is too hard. We're back into working long hours, and everyone else is walking out of the business with money, but we're doing okay, but not for the amount of time and energy we need to put into it. So that old obsessive workaholic thing started to kick in again. It's like, nah, I'm not doing this again. So we actually pulled the pin and we all walked away, mates. It was the easiest business divorce you could ever imagine. We still catch up with each other for drinks and beers, but once we'd done that, then we had the perfect opportunity with Know How to do what I'd always wanted to do, and that is to share the information and the knowledge. Because we'd had a very successful journey in the property sphere ourselves, and without the leash of some business partners around, that it always gets a little bit tricky. I then had the opportunity to start spreading the word, and the reason for that is that over the years, a lot of people said, "Oh, Bushy, I'd love to do what you do. Can you teach me how to do it?" That's why I wrote the book. That was my first entourage into moving from this one-to-one to a one-to-many type exercise. And then I'm really keen. I guess I get a lot of satisfaction, Rob, probably as you do, out of sharing knowledge and seeing the light bulb go off in other people's minds, and then seeing their lives transform over a series of years. It doesn't get any better than that for me, to be perfectly honest.
I like to think of it, Bushy, that if you're at the top of the mountain, the view is very good, but it's very lonely, and the top of the mountain's kind of pointy, and it's not very comfortable, I guess, where you're sitting. But if you come down the mountain just a little bit, I guess you can bring a few people up. There's a lot more people that can actually share the view. How much money do you actually need? I guess we all want to live by design, absolutely. But a lot of us have delusions of grandeur as to what we think is financial freedom. But in reality, we don't need any of it.
Spot on. Mate, we must be Siamese twins, I'm sure, Rob, because that's when people come to us to talk about property, we say, okay, we're going to park property over there for a minute. How much is enough? That's question number one. How much is enough? How much is enough for you to live the life you want to live the way you want to live it? And when you actually drill down into that, it isn't a massive amount. So, but if you spend the time, and this is where I encourage everyone to actually take the time and work out, well, what's your perfect day, week, month, year look like? How much income do you need to sustain that? That then determines what the size of the nest egg that you need to generate that's going to create that income flow. Once you're there, job done. And the biggest issue I see with a lot of investors in particular is why are you doing it? To make money. Well, how much? For what? What's it going to do? Because if you're not clear on that, then you're also not very clear on what type of property you need to be investing in, or what type of development you need to be doing, what sort of entity you need to be buying it in. Everything else folds out of what that very clear definition of what the end result needs to be.
Absolutely, and you touched on it before. It's a phrase I repeat often. It's start with the end in mind. If you know exactly where you want to go, then the next part is to have a look at where you are, and the difference between them is then a journey that you can actually map out. Just like a GPS, it's very easy. GPS needs to know where you are. It needs to know where you're going, and it's very easy when you go off track to be able to measure to bring yourself back on track. So
totally,
we're doing almost the identical things, but we're doing it with a different vehicle. So yours is more, I guess, long-term buy and hold. Ours is more, I guess, manufactured growth type approaches, but we're doing the exact same mechanism, for want of a better word.
Spot on, and this is what I love about property. There is no one silver bullet or one super solution that solves all problems. It's about what is right for you, and where you're at and where you're heading, what your risk level is. That sleep at night factor has got to be underpinning everything you do. But if you do take some time to get clear on that, and I go through chapter and verse that whole exercise in my book, The Freedom Formula, to give people a number of different ways of actually starting to put that together, and then actually coming up with their own freedom numbers. So, there's about 5 or 6 very key numbers that you need to know in relation to what that long-term exercise is. And once you're clear on those, then the actual property strategy that you need to adopt, because if we break a couple of those down, your lifestyle income is the first one. So how much do you need per year to satisfy that lifestyle? That then determines the nest egg number. The other really key number is the break-free timeline. So how many years before you want to be in that position? Because that duration will have a major impact on the sort of strategy you need. So if you're looking at doing something in 5 to 10 years, you need to be much more active and proactive in your approach. So property development is probably the only vehicle that's going to allow you to do that in such a short time. If you're more career focused and family orientated, and you don't want to create a second job when you're investing, you just really want to buy good quality properties that are going to grow in value over time, and then transition them into an income flow at the other end, then buy and hold can work. For those that really are time poor, and that's what we tend to focus on in helping those do that. But we are moving into a time, Rob, where we've just seen the second highest property boom in the 230-year history of the country happen over the last 2 years, thanks to COVID. Now that's effectively brought forward 5 or 6 years worth of capital growth. So I've been saying to people now, if you're looking to achieve big results in 10 years on a buy and hold strategy now, it ain't going to happen. So you're going to need to get more proactive. You're going to need to look at, anything from renovations at one end to full developments at the other to make that happen, depending on what your capacity and capability is and what your risk appetite is to make that happen. And of course, the other really big ingredient there is to make sure that you've surrounded yourself with an elite team that are good at each and every aspect of making that happen for you. And your only role, as I see as an investor, is to manage your managers to make sure that they're doing the right thing. That old analogy of if you're going to perform in an elite sport, if you wanted to try and beat I'm an AFL man, so if you wanted to beat the Melbourne Demons who won the premiership last year, you wouldn't rock up on the field yourself and try and beat those 18 specialists. You're better off being the manager and the owner of the team and having specialists in each and every position that are playing to your strategy and kicking your goals. And your only role is to manage those people to make sure that they're actually doing things in your best interests.
Absolutely. Now, but between the two of us, we're probably, as I said, the same framework, but different execution models. So it's probably good to, do a bit of a rounding to say, what are the options that actually exist for people? So fundamentally, how I assess it is there's really only 4 reasons to buy a property. So cash flow, capital gains, manufactured profit, and lifestyle. So where I think a lot of people go wrong is they don't know which strategy they actually want to execute, and they might buy a lifestyle property and then turn that into investment property and then wonder why it's not performing, or they want capital growth but they've not assessed the area correctly for their capital growth. It's really about being very clear on what your strategy is, and for me it's manufactured profit. That's forcing value on. But even then, it's dialing that in. But then there's 3 personality types to apply to those 4 properties. So there's the passive investor who, wants to, do a small amount of effort, research the right property, and then let the market do the heavy lifting. There's the active investor, which is, my end of the world, where, we're doing this sweat equity to actually force value on. And then there's the bit in the middle, the semi-passive. And this is where there's both of us have got crossover clients where, they might have bought a property that, some time ago had development potential but wasn't profitable at the time. And now all of a sudden the market, the city has grown towards it and it's started to become in demand. And all of a sudden it is a developable site and they're sitting on this asset that they don't know how to do anything with. That semi-passive approach might be, well, I might join forces with the developer to actually go and execute this for me, and together we'll share the wealth in that. Or the other approach would be, well, I've built all this equity through my passive approach. How do I leverage that equity to actually accelerate that? And maybe I can have a developer leverage some of that funds that I've created, and I can actually force that through. So there's really those 3 approaches on those 4 strategies.
And that's a great framework, and it's a framework that people need to spend some time getting their head around. And certainly talking to you or I will certainly point them in that direction, because as we both know, there is no one size fits all with this, and it does change over time. So, but getting really crystal clear on what you're doing and why you're doing it, rather than there's a lot of accidental investors out there, Rob, who, and I'd said a lot of them who buy a house to live in and then they'd go to buy another one and then they'll say, I will turn that into an investment property. Well, there's no fundamental basis for that at all. And putting the filters through it to look at which strategy you're adopting and then what are the key criteria that type of property needs to make are really important if you're serious about, advancing the cause as a result of that.
Absolutely. And to be clear to our audience, every strategy works, but it just doesn't work everywhere. And it only works if you get bloody good at it.
Spot on.
And so when you choose whatever strategy it is, whether it be capital gains, whether it be cash flow, whether it be manufactured profit, what you choose will then determine where that's going to work. And that's probably the key, is you got to start with that. What am I doing first? And then build up from that, not the other way around, not choose the area and then try to force something to happen in that area.
Totally, 100% agree. And I think the other key thing with that is that, because always hear this argument about, well, should I be pursuing cash flow or should I be pursuing growth? Now, for me, I talk about this in a fair bit of detail in the Freedom Formula, but it's a very easy answer to that exercise. If where you're heading, if we project forward based on the asset values that you have today, based on growth rates and taking off inflation and everything else, if that isn't going to reach the nest egg level that you need in the time frame that you've decided on, that's going to generate the income flow that you're looking for, you're following a basic growth approach. So that's about either growing equity or manufacturing equity. Once the nest egg's projected to reach that time frame, you're then into more of the cash flow exercise, and there's very different types of and styles of property you need to do at the cash flow end versus what you need to do in the growth end. So it's really important to get crystal clear, because the ones that I feel sorry for are the ones who pursue this cash flow exercise from day one. And if you throw a rope around it, the capacities for people are going to hit a ceiling at a point in time, and the amount of properties that you can accumulate and the amount of rent that you're going to achieve with those positive cash flow properties is never going to be enough to survive on. So
there's a distinct difference that I think between wealth creation, which is the capital growth, and I guess the cash flow that you actually need to put food on the table and fuel in the car and send the kids to school and all those sorts of things. And I think people try to put the order of those back to front. And, as soon as you start to do that, then you start to hit those glass ceilings that you're talking about. You need more equity to get into a deal to generate that small amount of cash flow, or you go into high cash flow type areas that don't have any capital growth, but they also don't have the fundamentals of the market that sit behind them. Mining towns and things like that it causes all sorts of pain. So being very clear on what is, and as you touched on, why. And
start with why, then look at the what. And I often say go for growth and then convert to cash flow, because that's the progression that we're talking about. So if your timeline is short, then you need to be active, which means that you're going to be going down the property development front. If you've got a 15 years plus and you simply don't have the time, or you're too fearful about being too active, then the buy and hold approach can work. But in both of those, it's going to get to a point where you need to convert the growth properties into a tax effective income stream. So there's a transition there. So I see a lot of investors who have this thought that I'll just buy properties, then I'll pay off the debt, and then I'll live off the rent. No, it won't get you there. If you go for growth, for either by manufacturing it or letting the tenant, the tax man, do some of the heavy lifting over time, there will become a point around when you're looking to reduce how much you work, where you're going to need to transition that portfolio into a more tax effective income stream, and that means potentially different property solutions at that point in time as well. Yeah.
Now, in my world, we aim for the financial freedom before the lifestyle, and we try to do that in a 3 to 5 year period. If someone's trying to do that in their, I guess, a more passive approach, what's the typical timeline that they're going to take if they go down that traditional investment approach?
So I'm very conservative with this, Rob, and I'm a conservative investor by nature, and I've done a lot of research on this. It's about 15 years. So you need if you're going to take a very passive approach to buying good quality properties in growth areas that are tightly held and allowing capital growth, the taxman and the tenant to do the work, you need to be budgeting for 15 years to do that. If you're wanting to make it happen, and you might get lucky and do it in 10, but it's more luck than good management, to be honest. Because if you look at the growth cycles around the country over the last 30 years, it takes about 15 years to go through a full cycle. So, but it can happen in 8 to 10 years, but I'll be banking on 15. If you're wanting to generate equity and manufacture growth early in that, then you need to be adopting your approach, Rob.
Yeah. And you touched on also a little earlier in the chat, Bushy, that because of the market that we've just gone through, the artificial boom that's been forced upon us, it's brought forward 4 or 5 years worth of that capital growth. So I'd anticipate anyone trying to get into, I guess, I guess, a more traditional investment approach right now, that 15 years is probably going to step out a little bit longer. Like how far out do you think that's probably going to happen in the next little bit? Do you think it's going to take a little longer for everyone, or?
Yeah, potentially. I just think you've got to be clever about location now, Rob. And as we know, if we're talking about the buy and hold piece, about 80% of the growth comes from the location, not from the property itself. So the real homework that now needs to be done, and I say to people, you've got to adopt a borderless approach to the exercise. Don't think that buying or building property in your backyard is going to get you there, because the chances of your location being in those top growth areas over the next 15 to 20 years is very unlikely, because there still will be locations that you can do that in 15 years, but you're going to have people around you who know where they are and why they are before you dip into that exercise. So hence why I say surround yourself with some independent and elite professionals. Don't go for the one-stop shops, because there's no checks and balances in that equation. But if you've got a team that can actually identify those A-grade areas and A-grade properties, you'll do okay. They're just going to be a lot harder to find.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the borderless approach. There's many advantages to that. I guess you're exposing yourself to different market cycles at different times. So, as you follow the different property clocks around the place, you'll be able to pick the sweet spot in, come in at 7 o'clock at the clock and pick up the upswing and then move to another area where the upswing's about to happen next. So you can take advantage of that process. But I guess I'm a little bit more selfish in that, and I go, well, if I'm actually distributing across many states, that I'm spreading all of my properties across lots of different land tax type initiatives, and I'm minimizing a lot of my land tax because I get a threshold here and a threshold there and a threshold somewhere else. And I guess that's equally as important, I guess, the holding costs of these things as well. So
absolutely. Yeah. And if you're looking at buy and hold, the structure of what you do is just as important. So, we spend a lot of time, because the devil's in the detail here, in making sure that the properties are at least covering themselves at cash flow neutral, that you're not going to retire on the rent. But if the property's covering itself and not impacting on salary savings or lifestyle, then you're going to be able to last the distance. Because if we're talking 15 years, then you want to make sure you've set this property up in the right way to enable you to get there. Because as we all know, that I think the last ABS stats that I heard were 54% of first-time investors sell a property in the first 5 years. And a lot of that is they haven't spent the time getting right down to the nitty-gritties on how much per week is that property actually going to cost me to hold, once every cost involved in buying and then holding that property is put into the mix. Well, part of what we help investors do is build it on paper first before you even start, and get a very clear picture on exactly how those numbers work, so you're going in with your eyes open.
Yeah. So in summary, it's know what you want to do, know why you want to do it, use those two, then determine where you're going to do it, and more specifically, do it by design so that you can actually get out. That I think whether you're going down your approach or my approach, those fundamentals are still very, very sound, irrespective. And it's really, where's your risk appetite sit, and otherwise as to what best sits with you.
Totally. And then weave in there what your actual capability to make that happen is, because that's going to differ. And if you can't do it on your own, then you've got to be creative in terms of the mechanisms that you can align yourself with others that may not have the borrowing capacity, may have equity, and vice versa, to start making things happen, to increase the portfolio, if that's what you need to do.
Yeah, very good. So, mate, if any one of my audience wants to reach out to you and have a bit of a chat about, I guess, your approach to things, Know How Property is the place. What's the best way for them to actually engage?
Yeah, really easy. Just jump on the website, knowhowproperty.com.au. You can just book an appointment. You just hit the purple button. And there's a number of ways that we can interact. We start off with a conversation. It's a pathways conversation, really. So we get a bit of an understanding of where you're at, what you're trying to achieve. And then we pretty much take it from there. The one thing that I will add, I guess, Rob, is that that's something that's a little bit unique about what we do, is that we pretty much become your orchestra leader in terms of the property, particularly for the buy and hold stuff. So we'll help you get really crystal clear on that strategy in terms of lifestyle, finance strategy, property strategy. We'll orchestrate the finance around that because we've got a broking team that makes that happen. But the piece that is a little bit unique about what we do is the orchestra leader role. So once we've helped you write your life symphony, we'll then organise the right instruments with the right players at the right time. And then we'll sit on your side of the table and actually coordinate their input, but also vet their input to make sure that what they're actually coming up with, whether that be the accountant, the buyer's agent, the project manager if it's a new build, the property managers, the quantity surveyors, all of the key players that are part of that, will actually be the client's extra set of eyes, ears, arms and legs to make sure that what's actually being put on the table is actually truly in the best interest and actually going to satisfy what the client's needs are. Because the area that I've seen this a little bit with buyer's agents, unfortunately, buyer's agents in particular have a vested interest in trying to get a quick sale, because if they don't get a sale, they don't get paid. And that can start to colour the sort of stuff that they're putting in front of you. So if you've got someone like yourself or like myself, and I've got a senior property assessor on our team, we will actually vet that in the context of the client strategy and make sure that what's being suggested meets the mark. So we've got a second layer of due diligence in terms of a macro, micro and a micro level that we then apply to properties to make sure that it's actually ticking all the boxes from the client side. And clients pay us a fee to do that, obviously, but it means that we can really add some value to make sure that the property solutions that they end up investing in are actually going to achieve the results that they're hoping it will.
Yeah, absolutely. If nothing else, it's an insurance policy to make sure that things don't go horribly wrong. So, worst case scenario, you get reassurance that you're on the right path, and best case scenario, you throw away a couple of dud sites that you would have gone into otherwise, and you're not waiting another 5 years because you made that mistake. So
spot on. We call ourselves the John West of property, Rob. That old John West ad where it's the fish that you reject that make John West the best. Well, we reject a lot of properties because we're pretty fussy, and like you, we wouldn't suggest a client invest in a property unless we were prepared to invest in it ourselves. So if it isn't hitting all of the marks as far as that macro, micro, micro level is concerned, it's a no, and keep looking. So because it's very easy to buy a property, but it's difficult to buy a good one.
Absolutely, mate. And for anyone who's not yet sure on what it is that they want to do and that sort of thing, I'd highly encourage them to, get involved in your Get Invested podcast. Have a listen. There's a back catalogue of a gazillion stories, a lot of lessons learned along the way to give you the insights as to whether or not you want to go down any one particular path. From there, they can then, know their best steps in how to go forward. Plus your reality talk, mate. So I don't know the link for the reality talk, but if they search for reality talk, they'll find you in many places. Just
go to realty.com.au and go to the channel section for the Realty Talk show. They're good sound bites. So, they're 5 or 10 minute segments where you can just get a taste. If something really grabs your appetite, then you can dive a bit deeper. But it gives you a great opportunity to get exposed to a whole wealth of different insights, disruptors, changes and innovations in the industry that may be useful to you.
Very good, mate. Any parting words of wisdom that you would like to give our audience?
Just to reinforce what you've said, Rob, and that is start with the end in mind. Get really clear around what property is going to do for you. Because I often say that, if kebabs gave me a better growth and a better yield, I'd invest in kebabs. But property just happens to be the best vehicle in Australia to make it happen. But get crystal clear on exactly what the end goals need to be, and then everything will work back from that. Don't focus on the property. The property is actually the last thing you need to be focusing on, because the property will be informed by the decisions you make once you decide what that end game looks like. So start with the end in mind.
Yeah, mate, I can attest to the fact that I have invested in many kebabs at many early hours of the morning, and so that's probably a fantastic place to actually part this, Bushy. So, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on board, and I can't wait for us to catch up again.
Likewise, really appreciate your time. Thanks, Rob.
See you, folks.
Bye for now.
To get a summary of all this investment gold in the show notes, just email me on hello@khgroup.com.au. khgroup.com.au. That's HELLO@khgroup.com.au. Or check us out at www.bushymartin.com.au/get invested. I look forward to joining you next week for another episode of the Get Invested podcast. So thanks for listening. And as always, dream as if you'll live forever and live as if you'll die